I'm going to open up my Bubble Girl PSD file in After Effects. So once again, project window over here at the upper left, I double click on that and I navigate to the PSD file, right? So just like last time, we don't want to import as footage. We actually want to import as composition retain layer sizes. And we can go ahead and create a composition for that. So make sure that is check marked. And then we click open and yes, okay, fine. And there we go. So I'll double click on the Bubble Girl composition and we can see foreground, middle ground, background. Great. And let's go ahead and color code those. We're going to put these layers into a 3D space and use a 3D camera. So one thing to know about 3D cameras in After Effects is it's not 3D in the way that we might think of, say, like a Pixar movie, where the objects in the frame themselves are three-dimensional and a camera can rotate around them. It's not like that at all. Rather, for these layers, the layers themselves will remain two-dimensional, but they can occupy a three-dimensional space, right? So it's, in other words, it's like sheets of paper arranged in a three-dimensional space. So in order to make that happen, down here at the bottom of your timeline, there's a little button here that says toggle switches and modes, right? And I'm going to click on that and it's going to give me my switches. Now, if you already had that, then you don't need to do anything. All right, so this little icon right here at it's kind of the rightmost icon. This is your 3D icon right here, and you want to make sure that all of those layers have the little cube icon selected. All right, and then we'll add a camera. So layer, new, and camera. And I'm going to create a one node camera, and I'll explain the difference between a one node and two node camera in a bit. But for now, we'll just go ahead and make that a one node camera. And I'm going to call this zoom effect, right? And for the angle of view, I'm going to change this to 35. And this can always be changed. Basically this allows for more of a wide angle or more of a telephoto lens look. So I'll change that to 35. I'll click OK. And there's my camera. I'll move it to the top. The camera, it doesn't really matter where the camera is. It could be in the middle like that. It could be at the bottom. It's not going to affect the actual animation, but I like to have it at the top just so I can distinguish it myself from the other layers. Now, in the composition window, you'll notice here at the bottom it says active camera view. And I'm going to switch that to zoom effect. And it doesn't look like a lot happened, but we're actually looking through the zoom effect camera now. All right, so one thing that's helpful when you're working with 3D cameras is to be able to work in two different views. So we are looking through the active camera view right now, but I want another view so that I can move the actual camera around. So I'm going to switch, right at the bottom of the composition window, I'm going to switch to two views horizontal. And so now I have two different views, and this one is way zoomed out on the left. You got to make sure and you got to select the view that you want to zoom in on, right? So I click on this left view, which happens to be top camera view. If you don't see the top camera view, which I think might be the default for After Effects, go ahead and switch it at the bottom of that view to top view. So now I can Command plus to zoom in a little bit. And just to give you an idea what we're looking at here, yes, we're looking at a top view, but here's my camera right here, my zoom effect camera. Right, so this is kind of like a bird's eye view. And of course, the obvious question is, where are my layers? Well, all of my layers, remember, these are like looking at sheets of paper. So they have no dimensionality to them. They have no three-dimensionality to them. They have no depth. They're just like sheets of paper that you arrange in space. So they're all here on this plane. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move certain layers back and stagger them in the Z space or depth space, right? And I'll start with the background. So in the timeline, I select background and I click on this blue arrow, which is the Z-axis arrow. So you'll notice that there's a blue arrow and a red arrow, right? So the blue arrow is for Z-axis, the red arrow is for X-axis, and you can't really see it right now, in this view at least, because it's pointing straight up toward us. But actually, if you look over here in the active camera view, you can see this green arrow, which is the Y-axis arrow. And yes, the letters do pop up when you hover over them. So yeah, I select that. I'm going to push that back in space. I can press the space bar on my keyboard and resituate that frame so that I can make sure and see that background layer. So it's pretty far back, and you can actually see that, kind of keeping in mind perspective, that it's pushed back here in the zoom effect camera view as well. So now I'll get the midground and I'll push that back. And the foreground, I can just leave that where it is, right? And if I'm really being kind of with an attention to detail, I'm going to want to push, again, I'll get my space bar so I can. So I'm going to want to push that background layer a little further back, right? Because if I think about it, the girl's hand, which is in the foreground here, and the girl's body are going to be closer to one another, logically, than the background would be in relation to her and her hand, right? All right, so now the obvious issue is that the background being way back here is really small in the frame, and we have all this black space around the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my timeline. This icon here, which is a white dot, allows you to solo. So you can do multiple layers, but I just want to have the background visible so I can deal with that. And I'm going to scale that up. So I'm going to go S for scale and click and drag so that that background fills the screen. So I'm not actually zooming the background back in. As you can see, looking at the top camera view to the left here, it's still back along the Z-axis. I just scaled it up on its own plane. So when I've gotten that done, I'll switch to the midground and S for scale, and I will scale that up as well. You might have to move this layer over. So that looks about right there. All right. And then I can unsolo these, and the background is not going to be an issue. And I can actually lock these layers if I want to. Here's the lock icon. I don't have to, but I might, just so I don't move them around accidentally. And the thing is, I'm not actually going to move the layers. I'm going to move the camera. So I'll go back to my top view where I can see the camera and maybe zoom out a bit. That's a little bit too far, maybe 25%. And before I do any of the animation, I'm looking at my composition timeline, and it's set for 3 seconds, which is a really long time for what we're going to do. And so I'll go up to composition and composition settings. Let's actually do 1 second. Now I'm going to take my camera and I'm going to zoom in on these layers. All right, so that's a position keyframe. So with the camera selected, I press P for position. My playhead is at the beginning. Click the stopwatch. And it doesn't need to be tons that you zoom in, right? So I move my playhead to the end of the timeline to create this new keyframe where I zoom in just a little bit. Like even like that, that's sufficient, right? And I'll just play that. Now, if you don't see anything happening, and notice I don't see anything happening, it's like, well, I put keyframes there. What's going on? Make sure that you click on the zoom effect camera view, right? So you're not actually able to see any animation unless you have that zoom effect camera view selected. All right, so now I play that back and that's fine. We have like a nice sense of depth. And if I want to, I can go back and tweak that later. We talked last time with the plotograph about nesting layers within layers, and that's what we're going to do with this one as well. So I'll take this Bubble Girl composition that's in my project window, and I'll click and drag it down to the composition icon right down here at the bottom of the project panel, and it says Bubble Girl 2. And I'm going to rename that. So control click, rename, and I'll call this Bubble Girl Master. All right. So I have visible to me this stretch option in my timeline. Now, you may or may not have that visible to you. So if you do not have that visible to you, you can click somewhere on this gray bar, probably not over one of these icons, but wherever you see a little bit of gray space toward the right. So right about where my cursor is hovering now, and control click, and you should get this drop down menu, hide this in columns, and we make sure and select stretch. All right. So I click on the blue numbers that say 100, and the stretch factor, I'm going to change that to 50. So if you're used to working in Premiere, this is the opposite of the way Premiere does it. Premiere, if you wanted something to go twice as fast, you would actually type in 200. But for After Effects, if you want something to go twice as fast, you type in 50. All right, so now that shrunk my composition from 1 second to half a second. All right, I'm going to duplicate that. Command D is in doggy. And I will take one of these layers, it doesn't really matter which, and I'll just put these in sort of the stair-step fashion. And I'll take the later instance of the nested composition, and I'm going to go to Effect, Channel, and Invert. Effect, Channel, and Invert. And don't forget that you can always go up to the Help menu and type in Invert if you don't remember exactly where to find it. And there it is, Channel Invert. And that should turn this layer, if I move my playhead over, should turn it to a negative. So I'll play that back, and I get that perpetual zoom. And what's nice about the 3D cameras is you can see it looks like the fingers are approaching faster than she's approaching, and she's approaching faster than the background is approaching. So it has that sense of realistic perspective to it. Now, the one thing that I am going to change, and this is purely optional when you do your spatial disorientation, maybe you like this negative that is sort of a color negative as well, but I'm going to add a hue and saturation in such a way that it's going to create a color scheme that's closer to this, right? So it's not quite a jump. So I'll go Effect, Color Correction, and Hue Saturation. And we talked a little bit about this Effects tab last time as well. So it's living right next to the Project tab. There's my Effects tab for the layer that I have selected. And there's my invert, you can see that, and then right below that is the hue saturation, and then right here where it says master hue, It's 0 times 0.0, right? So just with rotation, the 0 times is like how many 360-degree rotations. Well, I don't need to worry about that, but I'm going to go over to here to where it says 0.0, and I'm going to click on those numbers and type in 180. All right, so again, it's fairly close to the same color scheme, but I feel like that's a little bit less jarring. All right, so I'm not going to export this because there's a separate tutorial for that. If you need a review on how to export, either through Adobe Media Encoder or through After Effects, you can look at that tutorial. All right, so while we're in After Effects, we talked about the zoom, which is the one we just created, but I want to talk about the sort of pan or rotation option for spatial disorientation. So the other file that I left for you, if you double click on the project window, is this desert landscape, and it's a PSD, and I already separated the layers for you. And because it is a multi-layered project, we do want to import that as composition retain layer sizes, and select open and OK. And I'm going to go ahead now and skip right ahead to the part where the different levels of the desert are pushed back in space, because we don't need to really redo that again. So I'm going to skip in the tutorial to the place where that has already happened. If you haven't done this already, you can go ahead and pause the tutorial. I've gone ahead and I did the same thing I did with the zoom effect, but now with this desert landscape. And I'll quickly talk us through this. So one thing that is different about this is that I did not make the sky layer 3D. If we were looking out onto a distant landscape, the sky wouldn't seem to move because it's so far back in space that there's very little perceived movement. But I did make the background, mid-background, midground, and foreground all 3D. And finally, I turned off the image, and that's just a backup desert landscape image. So I went ahead and turned that off. And like I did with the zoom effect, I did create a camera. I am going to double click on this, and I did change this camera to a 50, so it's a little bit more telephoto. You can see here that the angle of view is a little bit different than that zoom effect. All right, so this time we're going to mix things up a little bit. So I want us to click on the pan effect camera. For the type, I'm going to create a 2-node camera. All right, and then I'll click OK. The 2-node camera, how it's different, I guess imagine something like this. You're walking down the street, right? And then you see something across the street that grabs your attention, and your head turns. You continue walking down the street the same way you were before, in the same direction, but your head turns to notice whatever it was that was across the street. So this 2-node camera works in a similar way. It can move in one direction, but focus on a specific point and keep its gaze on that point. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a point far out in the distance beyond the background layer so that wherever the camera moves, it keeps its gaze on that point. And the way that we're going to create that gaze is by going up to the Layer, New, and Null object, and select the null object. And the null object can control the camera, it can control different objects on the stage. Well, just like I've done with my other layers, my null object also has to exist in 3D space. So I will select 3D icon. So I'll select, it already should be selected, but I'll press return, and I'm going to call this camera null. All right. Okay. And so, as I said, I'm going to push that camera null far back in space. So you can see it, it's right here, right on the camera plane. I'm going to push that back past my green layer, which is my background layer. Now you might remember me saying when we started the spatial disorientation portion of the tutorial in After Effects that it was really kind of useful to color code the layers. And the reason why might be obvious, but since I'm in this top camera view and I can't actually see the physical layer, I can see this green line which corresponds to the color coding of that layer, so that I know that this green line is the background. I know that this yellow line is the mid background, right? And then the midground is orange and then the foreground is red. So my null is pushed back in space and I just need to make sure that's far enough back that it's, you know, well behind my background most layer. This is where it gets kind of weird, so bear with me. So still with the camera null layer selected, I'm going to press P for position, and I'm just going to leave that position parameter open, and then I'm going to go to the pan effect camera, right? So just to review that, for the camera null layer, we can see the position parameter open. Again, that's P for position. And now I single click on the pan effect camera, and then I click on the little disclosure for that, and then I click on transform, and I'm going to mess with the point of interest, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover my cursor over the stopwatch, and I'm going to press the Option key on my keyboard and click. All right, and that's going to give me these weird symbols down here, and then my numbers turn red. So, and then I also get this script over here, right? So one of these symbols is this little pick whip, this expression pick whip. And I'm going to click on that pick whip and drag it up to the camera null position parameter. So right over the position text. And now my expression, my script is telling me that my point of interest for my camera, again, that's that gaze. And the point of interest, that gaze, is what comes with the 2-node camera. 1-node cameras do not have a point of interest. So this whole thing would not work with a 1-node camera. All right, so once I have that parented, I can just click off of that. I'm going to create a keyframe now. Let's go ahead and hide the point of interest just so it's not distracting. Now I'm going to create a keyframe with my playhead at the beginning of the timeline on position. And I'm going to go up here to my top view and I'm going to click on my x-axis arrow. And you can see, I'm going to kind of go to an extreme here, but you can see as I move that around, its gaze is fixed on that point of interest, right? So I'm not going to move it that far over. Again, like less is more in this case, just a little bit. Right, so I'll move it just a little bit to the left. And I don't know if you can see this, but you can see some of the boundaries here with in the camera view. So you can always click the Z-axis to zoom in a little bit and clip those off, as I'll do here. All right, so I move my playhead to the end of the timeline. And once again, I take that x-axis arrow and I move it a little bit to the other side. Make sure that there's no, I don't see any of those edges. Oh, there's one. I'm going to bring that back a little bit. All right, so now I'll play that back. All right, so there's our pan, and you can see the sky does not appear to move. So remember, that is in 2D space, right? So it is not affected by this camera. All right, so once again, we'll take that desert landscape composition and we'll drag and drop that into the composition icon, and that will nest desert landscape. We'll change the stretch value to 50%, so half the length, and Command D with the layer selected to duplicate the layer, just like we did last time. I select the second iteration of the composition channel effect channel invert, and again you can leave it like this, or you can change this from a color negative with the hue saturation. So effect and color correction and hue saturation, and then I change that master hue value to 180. All right, and then we have this sort of like weird pan with a slight rotation. And you can see that the layers are still they're very 2D. They have a very 2D quality, but they do exist in this 3D space. All right, so once again, I won't talk about how to render this, since you can always go to the exporting tutorial. All right, and that is spatial disorientation.